When people think of rich families, they often think about the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts, but those pale in comparison to the wealth of J.P. Morgan. His wealth, adjusted to inflation, would be way over $370 billion. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. In today's video, we will explore how J.P. Morgan became so rich and how his family stayed that way for generations. Enjoy. J.P. Morgan was born into a wealthy family, but their wealth wasn't that great compared to other families. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, immigrated to the US from England after his father died. With him being only 22 years old and all the money his father left him, he began building his own business. Over the next few decades, he would grow his fortune to over $360 million. But even though he had quite a lot of money, it was nothing compared to what his son, J.P., would achieve. J.P. Morgan Sr. gave his son a fantastic education, hiring private tutors that taught him everything from math to history. He also hired a special tutor that taught young J.P. But then something unexpected happened. After just 1 year, J.P. Morgan's partners wanted out. So J.P. Morgan bought them out for $15 million and changed the name to Morgan Bank. This buyout made J.P. Morgan really rich, but it also put a ton of pressure on him. After all, he now had to manage a prestigious investment bank by himself. He certainly rose up to the challenge. He would go on to help several companies get funding, and over the next 2 decades, these investments would make him a fortune. But he was still just a small fish compared to the richest man in the world, Cornelius Vanderbilt. That was until the market crash of 1873. Vanderbilt had invested most of his wealth in railroads. But unfortunately, there were too many railroad companies and not enough customers. So the market crashed and Vanderbilt lost nearly all of his wealth. But while Vanderbilt was losing his wealth, J.P. Morgan was making his. He was able to take advantage of the falling prices and buy up large stakes in companies for cheap. One of the biggest deals he did was buying 10% of US Steel for $45 million. Then he turned around and sold this stake for $100 million. From that moment on, J.P. Morgan was considered one of the wealthiest men in the nation. But the most important thing he did during this time was lay the foundation of his empire. He understood that once people trusted him with their money, he could do whatever he wanted and become literally as rich as he wanted. To see why this is, let's look at the banking industry at the time. Back then, if you wanted to invest in a company, you would have to find a bank that would take your money and lend it to that company. The problem was that banks were very picky with who they lent money to, and they also charged extremely high interest rates. But J.P. Morgan offered something different. He said that he would only charge a fair interest rate, and that he would also take risks that other banks wouldn't. For example, he would fund artists whose works weren't popular at the time, like Claude Monet, and he would also finance entire rail lines, even if they seemed unprofitable. This reputation made J.P. Morgan the favorite banker of American millionaires, but it also made him a target. In 1894, J.P. Morgan was almost taken down by a bear raid. Bear raids are attacks on a stock's price orchestrated by short sellers. Basically, they would spread rumors about a company and short the stock at the same time. If the stock price fell, they would make a ton of money. And if the stock price rose, they would simply buy back the stock and make even more money. The bear raid against J.P. Morgan was led by a famous investor named George Fisher. George had teamed up with J.P. Morgan's rivals, and together they shorted Morgan's stocks. As expected, the stock price fell, but J.P. Morgan managed to survive the crisis. However, he knew that he needed to adapt if he wanted to continue growing. So he decided to expand internationally and take his bank public. These moves paid off, and JP Morgan was soon one of the wealthiest men in the world. But his greatest achievement came during the Panic of 1907. The Panic of 1907 was one of the worst financial crises in American history. Banks were failing left and right, and the entire economy was collapsing. But then JP Morgan stepped in and saved the day. You see, there was a bank called Knickerbocker Trust Company. It had made some bad investments, and it looked like it was about to collapse. This would be a disaster, since it had many other banks invested in it. So JP Morgan took action. He teamed up with several of his rich friends, and they injected $25 million into the failing bank. This didn't solve the bigger problem, though. There was still a run on banks, and the economy was still collapsing. So JP Morgan did something no one thought possible. He organized the 5 biggest banks in America and told them that they needed to unite if they wanted to save the economy. Together, they created a central bank that lent money to banks that needed it. This saved the economy, but it also made JP Morgan a national hero. People went crazy over JP Morgan, and he was seen as the savior of the American economy. But this fame didn't last long. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created, and JP Morgan lost his status as a hero. After all, the Fed was supposed to be the Central Bank of America, not JP Morgan. Also, JP Morgan was getting old, and he wanted to spend his remaining years doing something else other than managing a bank. So he decided to pass the torch to his son, Jack. Jack was actually JP Morgan's adopted son. You see, JP Morgan's biological son, Paul, had died at the age of 19 from a heart condition, so JP Morgan adopted his nephew instead. Jack grew up in a mansion with 84 rooms, and he attended elite prep schools before going to Harvard. From the time he was young, Jack was interested in collecting art, but his father never approved of this hobby. When Jack graduated from Harvard, he joined his father's company and worked there for the next decade. During this time, he worked hard and eventually won over his father. So, JP Morgan finally allowed Jack to collect art. It wasn't long before Jack became one of the most important employees of the company. But tragedy struck once again when Jack got sick with the Spanish flu. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, most people who got the disease recovered. But Jack's case was different. He quickly became very sick, and he ended up dying at the age of 36. Once again, JP Morgan had to adopt another child. This time he chose Jack's son, also named JP Morgan. Little JP Morgan grew up during the Great Depression and World War II, but these events didn't affect him because he lived in a bubble. His grandfather, JP Morgan Sr., showered him with love and money and hired tutors to teach him everything he could possibly learn. But despite having the best education money could buy, JP Morgan III failed to live up to his family's expectations. He was uninterested in the family business and preferred playing golf instead. When JP Morgan Sr. died, JP Morgan III took over the family business, but he wasn't interested in managing it. He would hire professionals to do it for him, and he would mostly focus on collecting art. Over the years, he would build up the largest art collection in the world. But this hobby didn't bring in any money. In fact, it cost a ton of money. But JP Morgan didn't care. He had billions of dollars, and he was happy spending it on things that made him happy. And while he spent billions on art, he also gave away billions to charities. He donated over $1 billion throughout his life, which is worth over $15 billion today. As you can see, each generation of the Morgan family had its own JP Morgan. But in my opinion, JP Morgan II was the best. He saved the American economy multiple times and helped build the foundations of modern finance. And besides that, he also had quite the interesting personality. For example, he was a teetotaler who didn't smoke or drink. He also hated wasting time and always tried to do more with less. Perhaps the best story that shows JP Morgan's personality is when a group of millionaires asked him if he would join them for a lunch break. He declined the offer and said, "I haven't come to play golf." Anyway, do you think you would have liked to meet any of the JP Morgans? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you want to see more videos about rich families. And of course, consider joining our community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.